nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system, we already know from before, okay, is the visceral motor division of the PNS. Okay. So now we're focusing our efforts now on just visceral motor pathways and information, okay? So we know that we can further break down autonomic nervous system into parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about each of them. So visceral motor, okay, pathways are going to be in charge of visceral reflexes, okay? So these are reflexes that we don't have control over, okay? So things like blood pressure, okay? The ability to urinate, okay? We don't have control over that. When your body tells you gotta pee, you gotta pee. Fortunately, there is some skeletal muscle involved in that, which we'll talk about when we talk about urinary system. The ability to have a bowel movement, same thing, okay? Events that are out of your control. And so we know that effectors for these pathways are limited to three: smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Okay, so nothing really new there, just a topic review. Okay, so when we're talking about the autonomic nervous system, let's just compare it to what we already looked at, which is the somatic motor pathway, okay? So in this picture, on the bottom, the red neuron represents a somatic motor pathway, and the yellow represents a visceral motor pathway. So just looking at the two pathways, okay, give me some similarities, some differences, give me something. Give me something. What looks the same, what looks different, comparing the two pathways?
They both exit via the ventral root.
Okay, so not both of them, right? One of them does. Oh, sorry, root. I'm thinking horn. You're right, yes, okay. So both pathways exit out the ventral root because we're talking about motor. Correct. Okay, what else?
They both have Schwann cells.
Okay, they both have Schwann cells, but you can go a step further and say, is there a difference perhaps between the two pathways in regards to the Schwann cells? So the yellow pathway, is it totally myelinated? No, it's not, right? So the first neuron is myelinated in the yellow pathway, in the visceral motor pathway. The second neuron is not, okay? Which lends itself to another concept between the two. How many neurons are involved in a somatic motor pathway? One. How many neurons are involved in a visceral motor pathway? Two. Okay. Good. All right, what else? Similarity or difference between the pathway?
The location of the cell body.
Okay. Explain. To get that signal to the effector, not only because there's a synapse, but because the second neuron in the chain is not myelinated. Okay. Okay, good. I think we pretty much covered all of the characteristics on this slide. One other one that you can't really see very clearly is that the somatic motor axon is thicker inherently than the visceral motor axon. So visceral motor axons do not carry as much girth, so they don't have as much neural tissue in them. Okay, so let's review. All right, it's always good to repeat information. So for somatic motor pathways, okay, We know that the target is skeletal muscle, so it's a voluntary pathway. There's only one neuron involved in that pathway, and that pathway is always stimulatory. Because we say that the overall effect of the skeletal muscle is to do what? To contract, right? So that's stimulatory. Okay, so let's contrast that with autonomic innervation or visceral motor innervation pathways that we just mentioned. So they're gonna target our smooth muscle, our cardiac muscle, and our glands. We now know there's two neurons in the pathway, okay? And depending on what division of the autonomic nervous system is in control, we're gonna talk about sympathetic versus parasympathetic effects. And that's gonna contribute to an effect that can be either stimulatory or it can be inhibitory. Okay. So not all visceral motor pathways are stimulatory. They can be inhibitory. Okay. All right, so let's compare and contrast here. So we've talked briefly about these divisions. Now let's get into a little bit more detail. So parasympathetic, okay, we've already described it as rest and digest, and sympathetic we've described as fight or flight, like an emergent situation, okay? So for parasympathetic, because it's rest and digest, this is the pathway that's basically gonna control your overall body's homeostasis. So basic maintenance, you're conserving energy, like right now, your parasympathetic nervous system is in control, okay? Versus sympathetic, okay? If you're going to the gym to exercise, you need extra metabolic effort, okay? So this picture is really nice because on the left it shows you parasympathetic, on the right it shows you sympathetic, okay? And both of these divisions can affect the same effectors, okay? So you'll see a lot of repetition in terms of the organs. But it's the effect at those particular organs that differs depending on which division is in control. Okay? Okay, so parasympathetic pathways, all right? The first neuron in the chain for parasympathetic pathways, okay, can exit the central nervous system either at sacral divisions S2, S3, or S4, or it can exit up in the brain at cranial nerves. What a big surprise, we've already looked at this. 3, 7, 9, and 10. Okay, the 4 cranial nerves that have visceral motor responsibilities. Coming back to that concept, okay? What is cranial nerve 3 again? Oculomotor 7, facial 9, glossopharyngeal 10, vagus. Okay, so we'll talk more about that. So if you look at parasympathetic on the left, the purple first neuron in the chain, okay, is gonna exit the CNS either at sacral levels S2, S3, S4, or it's gonna exit the brain for cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, or 10. Okay, so we also can call the parasympathetic division the craniosacral division because that's where those neurons or those pathways exit the central nervous system. Okay. Okay. So now for sympathetic, sympathetic is green in the picture. Sympathetic first neurons in the chain will exit the CNS at spinal levels T1 down to L2. Okay? So T1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. L1 and 2, okay, are where we find the first neurons in the chain of sympathetic pathways, okay? So we can call the sympathetic division the thoracolumbar division, okay? And keep in mind, just because these first neurons exit in between T1 to L2, that doesn't mean that those pathways only affect your thorax and the top portion of your lumbar region. Those pathways can spread. Those pathways can go up, they can go down, they can affect your entire body. Okay, so they're not just localized to that one location. But The only place you're gonna find the first neuron in the chain for sympathetic pathways is in between spinal levels T1 to L2 in the CNS, okay? So that's gonna be in the lateral horn of gray matter of the spinal cord of spinal levels T1 to L2, okay? So thoracolumbar division. Okay, so now looking at the organs, okay? So if we are resting and digesting, like you guys are now, just sitting, listening to lecture, okay? Parasympathetic nervous system is in control, okay? So those pathways going to the heart, what do you think the overall effect would be? Do you think it would elevate heart rate or reduce heart rate? Reduce heart rate. You're resting and digesting, right? What about respiratory rate? Up or down? Down. You're just relaxing, okay? And when respiratory rate is down, you don't have to have as much gas exchange. So your airways don't have to be super wide. They can be constricted, they can be smaller because you're just relaxing. You don't have that much demand for gas exchange right now, okay? Okay, what about digestive organs, like the stomach, the pancreas, and the gallbladder? If the parasympathetic is in control and we're resting and digesting, what kind of an effect do you think it's gonna have on those kind of organs? Stimulatory, right? Because you're digesting. So stomach, pancreas, gallbladder, positive, meaning stimulation. We're stimulating digestive organs. Same thing with salivary glands, okay? We start digestion in the mouth. We'll talk about that in the next unit of study, but salivary glands are stimulated. Okay. Now, conversely, all right, if you're in a fight or flight situation, okay? If you're in a fight or flight situation, what do you think that does to heart rate? Does it stimulate it or inhibit it? It stimulates it. Okay, so there's a plus by the heart. So these pathways innervate the same organs, but they have different effects. So what about your lungs? If sympathetic nervous system is in control, is it gonna increase respiratory rate or decrease?
Increase.
Increase, right? Same thing with blood pressure. It's not represented on this table, but blood pressure too would go up. To constrict the heart, constrict the blood vessels and make the heart work harder, okay? So when you're in a fight or flight situation, do you have time to digest? No, there's no time, okay? So the digestive organs then are gonna be inhibitory, okay, that were once stimulatory. Now liver is stimulatory because the liver is a giant sugar bank for you. So when you're under duress or you're working out, the liver is gonna give you sugars. And the adrenal glands are what, we'll talk about that shortly, is what gives you your adrenaline. So adrenaline is definitely gonna be necessary in a stimulatory environment. So also, when you're in fight or flight, do you have time to go to the bathroom?
No.
No, there's no time. So the bladder's inhibited, but if you're resting and digesting, certainly you have time to do that. Okay? Okay. Before I forget, in the autonomic supplement that I have for you guys on Canvas, at the end of the review packet, you'll see a table. And the table lists organs, and it lists sympathetic effects and parasympathetic effects. That table is fair game for a lecture exam, okay? So review the organs and think about what would happen when sympathetic nervous system is in control versus parasympathetic, okay? It talks about your eye, constricting your pupil, okay? So constricting your pupil allows you to see closer to you, which is right now, okay? In a sympathetic situation, fight or flight, you need to see further away. It dilates your pupil in order to do that, okay? So dynamic counteraction basically means at any one point in time, both systems are kind of partnering with each other to figure out what the situation is and what's necessary, Most of the time, like I mentioned before, for heart rate, parasympathetic nervous system is in control. It's controlling and lowering your heart rate. Otherwise, your heart rate wants to beat at 100 beats per minute naturally. That's too fast. So parasympathetic nervous system is really gonna override that until you need higher heart rate, which is, for example, when you are going to the gym and you're pushing your skeletal muscle to contract, okay, and produce more sarcomere shortening, right? That's gonna require energy. That's gonna require mitochondria, all that good stuff that you guys already know. Okay. Okay, so let's basically compare and contrast parasympathetic versus sympathetic pathways, okay? So, top picture here is a sympathetic pathway, all right? So this is a sympathetic pathway, bottom is parasympathetic, okay? Similar starting point, okay, because it's a visceral motor pathway, we're starting in the lateral horn of gray matter of the spinal cord, okay? Okay, so we know already that both sympathetic and parasympathetic have a 2-neuron chain pathway. That's visceral motor pathway, 2 neurons in the chain, okay? That's the bottom line. Both divisions have a way station, which is basically a synapse, and that synapse is going to occur at a ganglion, okay? Which we already know is a collection of cell bodies in the PNS, okay? For our purposes, that's going to be the connector or the communication between the first neuron in the chain and the second neuron in the chain, so that's where you're gonna find synapse. So because there's 2 neurons in the chain for both of these pathways, the first neuron in the chain is called the pre-ganglionic neuron because it's before you hit the ganglion, right? The second neuron in the chain is going to be called the postganglionic neuron because it comes after the ganglion, okay? Okay. Also, in both pathways, the pre-ganglionic neuron, so the first neuron in the chain, is going to release acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter. Okay, so both pathways release acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter. Okay. Okay. So essentially, this is coming from Heather. So this is basically just showing you, it's a picture taken from your book, it's just showing 2 different pathways, one's sympathetic, one's parasympathetic, okay? And it's acetylcholine that's released by the preganglionic neuron in both examples. That's all it's showing. Okay, so that's just a commonality between parasympathetic and sympathetic pathways. That first neuron in the chain is going to secrete acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter, okay? So now, the differences, okay, includes the location of where we find the preganglionic cell bodies. So this is where we get into craniosacral versus thoracolumbar, okay? So for sympathetic pathways, you're gonna find the preganglionic cell bodies, okay, sympathetic pathways, in the lateral horn of spinal levels T1 to L2. Okay? And that's green in the picture, same thing, green. Okay? So for parasympathetic, craniosacral, let's start with the sacral component. Sacral component, you're going to find those preganglionic cell bodies in the lateral horn of spinal levels S2, S3, and S4. Okay. In the cranial region, you're going to find those cell bodies in clusters of gray matter in the CNS that we called what? What do we call clusters of gray matter in the CNS?
Basal nuclei.
Basal nuclei or brain nuclei. since we're talking about cranial nerves right here, right now, only these four, we'll call them cranial nerve nuclei. So that's where you're gonna find the cell bodies of cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10 in cranial nerve nuclei. Okay, so those preganglionic cell bodies are gonna be found in nuclei. Okay? Most of them located in the medulla oblongata. Okay. More differences, okay? So there's differences in cell body locations of the preganglionic neuron. There's also a difference in the location of the synapse, okay? Or the way station is what we're calling it, okay? And because there's a difference, it changes the length of the preganglionic versus the postganglionic fibers, okay? All right, so top picture sympathetic, bottom picture parasympathetic, okay? Looking at both pathways, which ganglion is closer to the CNS, sympathetic or parasympathetic? Which ganglion is closer to the CNS? And it's also how you interpret the picture. Yeah. So the ganglion here in sympathetic is closer to the CNS than in the parasympathetic pathway, because the ganglion in the parasympathetic pathway is typically at or near the effector organ. So in this example, they're just giving you the wall of an intestinal organ, okay? And they're just showing you that that ganglion is located at the wall of that intestinal organ, which is at the effector, okay? So, if the ganglion in a sympathetic pathway is closer to the CNS, does that make the preganglionic neuron relatively shorter or longer?
Shorter.
Shorter. And in a parasympathetic pathway, that makes that preganglionic axon or fiber longer. Okay. Branching at the effector, okay? So we look at a sympathetic pathway, this kind of branching here of the axon terminals of that second neuron, versus, it's kind of hard to see here, but that second neuron, cell body in the ganglion, it literally has just one extension and its axon terminals right there in the lining of that organ's wall, okay? So you can technically say that the branching at a parasympathetic, the branching of a parasympathetic postganglionic neuron is very localized. Very localized, it's right there, okay? Versus a sympathetic postganglionic neuron, the effect is gonna be more widespread, okay? More axon terminals, spread wider. And that is what lends itself to sympathetic effects, okay? Because, for example, okay, when you sweat, do you only sweat on your face?
No.
No, you sweat, full body sweat, okay? Depending on what you're doing. That's a sympathetic response. And that's due to this widespread configuration of sympathetic pathways, okay? Okay. Let me further drive that home. Because remember, sympathetic pathways can exit, okay, between T1 to L2 in the CNS, but they can go up or down, okay? They have a full body effect. They can go from your eye all the way down to your genitals, but they're exiting between T1 to L2. They still can spread, okay? And that's what gives that widespread effect. Another difference is the type of neurotransmitter that's secreted by the second neuron in the chain, the postganglionic neuron, okay? In a parasympathetic pathway, acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter. So in parasympathetic pathways, the neurotransmitter for both the pre- and postganglionic neuron is acetylcholine, okay? Sympathetic pathways, the neurotransmitter secreted is norepinephrine. It's also called epinephrine. which in layman's terms is what? Adrenaline. Secreted by what organ in the body?
Adrenal.
Your adrenal gland. Good. Okay, making that connection. Okay. What else did I want to say? Okay. So the fact that the postganglionic neuron in both of these pathways secretes a different neurotransmitter, okay, that lends itself to why these pathways can innervate the same organs but produce a different effect, right? So sympathetic pathways, norepinephrine, if we're talking about the heart, for example, okay, and sympathetic nervous system is in control, okay, norepinephrine is going to be secreted from that postganglionic neuron, and that is going to increase heart rate. Sympathetic nervous system is in control. If we're resting and digesting, like right now, okay, on the heart, postganglionic neuron for parasympathetic pathways in control, acetylcholine is going to be released instead. And that's going to provide reduction of heart rate. So that's how you get two different effects from two different pathways that are innervating the same organ, right? That's what that dynamic counteraction is. It's because there's two different neurotransmitters being secreted by those postganglionic neurons. Okay. 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 All right, so let's review. It's always good to review. So, parasympathetic pathways, okay, two neuron chain. We know now that the preganglionic fiber is relatively long, postganglionic is relatively short, okay? And we can further say now, and again, we're summarizing when we're naming these ganglia. We're just giving a summary term, okay? So we have multiple pathways. We have 3, 7, 9, and 10, okay? And we have S2, S3, S4, okay? So those preganglionic fibers, okay, of 3, 7, 9, and 10 are going to synapse in a ganglion, okay? Each one of those ganglion, you can see in the picture, has a different name. Are we memorizing all those names? No, we're not, okay? But we are going to call them cranial ganglia, okay, because they're in the head, because they're associated with cranial nerves, cranial ganglia, okay? Now, for those pathways that are S2, S3, S4, those preganglionic fibers are going to synapse in a ganglion at or near or on the effector, and we're going to call those ganglion terminal ganglia because they're at the end of the road, terminating on the organ. Okay, so summary term here. Okay. All right. Now, we've been so focused on somatic motor for cranial nerves, okay? We need to circle back now and concentrate only on the 4 that have visceral motor responsibilities, okay? And when we're talking about visceral motor, this is parasympathetic pathways, okay? Write that down on here so you remember that. Cranial nerve pathways, these are parasympathetic pathways, right? Craniosacral, parasympathetic pathways. So now what I want you to know is the responsibilities for each of these nerves parasympathetically, okay? So cranial nerve 3 we said was what again? Oculomotor, okay? So, oculomotor is going to innervate the ciliary body. Oh, we already identified that in lab, we know where that is, okay? Ciliary body is smooth muscle, and the ciliary body controls the size of the pupil, which we know is an opening, okay? So, it's gonna control and contract the ciliary body for smooth muscle, which is going to constrict the pupil, make it smaller, so that you can focus on things that are closer to you, like right now, taking notes, okay? And it's also going to allow the lens to bulge, okay, to allow more light into the eye, okay? Again, we'll talk a little more detail about the eye next week in special senses, but for now, the lens bulges, it lets more light in, the pupil constricts, so you can focus on things that are closer to you, okay? Okay, so cranial nerve 7 is what again? Facial. Okay, so it's gonna innervate glands, okay? Your lacrimal gland, what's the overall effect then? Glandular, what do glands do?
Secretion.
Secretion, right? So it's gonna secrete tears. Submandibular glands, sublingual glands, what are those glands gonna secrete? Saliva, right? Because you're resting and digesting. Okay. All right, cranial nerve 9 is what again? Glossopharyngeal. So those fibers are going to terminate on the parotid gland. We'll identify that in digestive system, but the parotid gland sits, it's your largest salivary gland, and it sits right on top of your masseter muscles on either side. Okay, so if you take like if you eat a sour gummy bear and your cheeks just cramp, that's because your parotid glands are like, you're putting them on like overdrive. Okay, and then cranial nerve 10 is?
Vagus.
Vagus, not spelled like Las Vegas. Okay, so those postganglionic fibers then are gonna terminate on a whole bunch of stuff, okay, in the thorax and the abdomen. So in the picture, okay, cranial nerve 10, that preganglionic neuron goes from the medulla all the way down into the thorax, affects heart rate, affects respiratory rate, okay, and also to digestive organs. For example, the liver. More than that, it actually handles a majority of your small intestine and about the first half of your large intestine, which this next picture kind of drives home. So for cranial nerve 10, vagus nerve, I'm just bracketing this to show you that, okay, all of these organs, this is all vagus nerve coming down here, boom. And it does like the first half of the large intestine and pretty much all of your small intestine. So it's a big deal. Like, vagus nerve is a big deal for parasympathetic. You got a vagus nerve injury way up here, you know, survival is unlikely because of the responsibility of that cranial nerve down in the lower depths, right, of the body. Okay. All right, so parasympathetic outflow of S2, S3, S4, okay, is gonna take care of the rest of the organs in the pelvic region. So genitals, rectum, bladder, things like that. Okay, stuff at the bottom is your sacral. Okay, so all parasympathetic outflow. Okay, so let's review sympathetic pathways. Okay. Green, all right. Sympathetic pathways, okay, we've already determined the ganglia are closer to the CNS. So that gives us a relatively shorter preganglionic fiber and a relatively longer postganglionic fiber, okay? Now, the preganglionic fiber, we know, exits the CNS at the lateral horn of spinal cord levels T1 down to L2. And where that preganglionic fiber is going to synapse is in, what a big surprise, one option, sympathetic trunk ganglion. Okay, so that's one option for a sympathetic pathway. Sympathetic trunk ganglion. It's also called paravertebral because it's on either side of your vertebra. We're calling it sympathetic trunk ganglion. Okay. Or you have another option. Preganglionic fibers can go through the sympathetic trunk ganglion, bypass it, and synapse on other ganglion. Okay? Do those ganglion have names? Yes. Do we know each of the names? No. We're going to call them collateral ganglia. Okay? They're also called prevertebral ganglia because they live anterior to your vertebra. So they call them prevertebral, but we're gonna know them as collateral ganglia. So that's the second option for a sympathetic pathway. It can either synapse in the sympathetic trunk ganglia, or it can bypass it and synapse in a collateral ganglia, of which there are different names. We're not knowing them. We're knowing them as collateral ganglia. Okay? And pretty much within sympathetic trunk ganglia, there's about one ganglion, one enlargement per spinal level. But again, the sympathetic trunk ganglion allows for information to go up or down for that widespread effect. Okay? It's not like a reflex where information goes in and it comes straight out. Information can go up or down. Okay? Okay, so this is basically showing you the two options. So here's sympathetic trunk ganglion. Here's what we've identified on nerve man. We've identified them on exposed spinal cord. And here are the collateral ganglia. Okay, they each have names. We're not knowing the individual names. We're just calling them collateral ganglia. That's a second option for pathways. Okay. Either one doesn't matter. It's still a relatively shorter preganglionic fiber in comparison to a parasympathetic pathway. Okay. So collateral ganglia, okay, unlike sympathetic trunk ganglia, because you have a sympathetic trunk ganglia on either side of the spinal cord, they're like paired, okay? Collateral ganglia are not paired, and they're not arranged by segments, by spinal levels. They're just hanging out anterior to your vertebra, okay? Okay. So where you have a sympathetic trunk ganglion on the right, and then you have a sympathetic trunk ganglion on the left, you won't have that for collateral ganglia. Collateral ganglia are just one individual structure just hanging out. Okay, you don't have a right or a left collateral ganglia, it's just one. Okay. Questions so far? Okay. Okay, so this picture we've seen before in lab, okay? It looks like that vertebra model with those sympathetic trunk ganglia on either side and spinal nerves sticking out. Okay, so we're gonna add a little bit to that picture. So, sympathetic trunk ganglia, one on either side, okay? We've identified it's a collection of cell bodies in the PNS, okay? Exiting the spinal cord, we have two roots. We have a dorsal root and we have a ventral root. And both of those roots come together to form a what?
Spinal nerve.
A spinal nerve, right? And I said the first branching off of a spinal nerve is called a ramus, right? Of which we have a dorsal and we have a ventral, okay? And we describe the dorsal ramus as supplying what part of the body? Your erector spinae, and that's it, okay? Everything else in the body is supplied by the ventral ramus, including your nerve plexuses, okay? Plexuses don't supply the erector spinae, okay? They supply your neck, your arms, your legs, okay? They don't supply your erector spinae. Okay. So coming off of the ventral ramus, okay, we have what are called rami or ramus communicans. We have a gray and we have a white. I wonder what those colors represent. What do you think white represents? Myelin, right? So how would you know which one's gray and which one's white on a black and white picture? The gray ones are always medial. The white ones are always lateral. Okay, so if you're looking at a copy of something and you're like, oh my God, I don't know which is which, gray is always medial, white is always lateral. Okay, the gray and white rami communicans allow for communication between a spinal nerve and the sympathetic trunk ganglion. Okay. So you're only gonna find these rami communicans between T1 to L2. Sympathetic pathways. Okay, so we have several different examples of sympathetic pathways that we're gonna talk about. Okay. In your autonomic lecture supplement, I have drawings that you can draw the preganglionic fiber, the postganglionic fiber, and you can practice the different pathways, okay? On the exam next Thursday, I'm not going to make you draw, okay? So you don't have to worry about drawing. But you can still utilize that as knowing where, right, preganglionic cell bodies are, where's the synapse, where's the cell body of the postganglionic fiber, does it go up, does it go down, does it stay at level? You can still practice the pathway and in your mind go over the mechanics or the anatomy of each pathway. But I will not make you draw a pathway, okay, so you don't have to worry about that. All right, so we're gonna talk about each of these bullets, okay, and these are each gonna be options for sympathetic pathways, okay? So let's talk about first, number one is the at-level option, okay? All right. So, again, this is a picture that's not new to us. Cross-section of the spinal cord, because we're talking about sympathetic pathways, this is gonna be anywhere from T1 to L2, okay? That preganglionic neuron originates in what part of the spinal cord? Lateral horn, okay? That axon exits the lateral horn, it enters what?
Ventral root,
The ventral root, and then it enters what?
spinal nerve,
The spinal nerve, and from there it enters the
the ventral
ventral ramus. Remind me, is the preganglionic neuron in a visceral motor pathway myelinated or unmyelinated? Myelinated. So that axon is gonna go through the gray or white rami communicans?
White.
White. Goes through the white. It synapses in the sympathetic trunk ganglion. Oh, what a big surprise. A ganglion is a collection of cell bodies in the PNS, okay? Which is where we're gonna find the cell body of that postganglionic neuron. That postganglionic neuron, remind me, in a visceral motor pathway, is it myelinated or unmyelinated? Unmyelinated. So that axon is going to exit out the what?
Gray.
Gray rami communicans. Continue down that ventral ramus to whatever peripheral nerve, wherever in the body it's going, and it's gonna provide a sympathetic effect, okay? So sympathetic effectors, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. The example here is gonna be the erector pili muscle of your skin, which is smooth muscle. Do you have voluntary control over your erector pili muscle? Nope. So that's smooth muscle. Sweat glands, it's gonna stimulate sweat. Blood vessels, because it's a sympathetic pathway, what is it gonna tell the tunica media to do? Smooth muscle of the tunica media. What's it going to do? Is it gonna contract or relax?
Contract.
It's gonna contract, which is gonna cause blood pressure to go up, right? Which is a sympathetic effect. Okay. All right, so that's the at-level option, okay? Okay, so the up-down option, same effectors, we're talking about sympathetic effects here, the same effectors, okay? So we've got, again, preganglionic fiber originating in the lateral horn, exiting out the ventral root, entering a spinal nerve, into the ventral ramus. Because it is myelinated, it goes through the white rami communicans, and instead of synapsing at that same level sympathetic trunk ganglion, it's gonna go up a level. It can also go down a level. It can go up 2 levels. It can go down 3 levels, okay? So it goes up a level, and that postganglionic neuron is then gonna exit the gray rami communicans, exit the ventral ramus, enter whatever peripheral nerves going to the body to provide the same sympathetic desired effect, okay? So this is why a sympathetic effect is widespread. You sweat all over the place when you go to the gym. You don't just sweat on your face. It's a full body effect, okay? Because this trunk ganglion cannot allow for things to spread. Okay. Splanchnic nerve option, okay? So for this option, it originates in the same location, lateral horn. It exits ventral root, spinal nerve, ventral ramus, okay? Myelinated, white rami communicans. It goes past sympathetic trunk ganglion into a special structure called a splanchnic nerve. And that preganglionic neuron then is going to synapse in a collateral ganglion, which we've already identified, okay? So the cell body of that postganglionic neuron is going to be in the collateral ganglion, and it's going to exit the collateral ganglion, enter whatever peripheral nerve, and terminate on that sympathetic effector. And this example is going to be the wall or the inner lining of your intestines. Okay, so it's probably going to target the smooth muscle of your intestines. And because it's a sympathetic effector, it's most likely going to inhibit digestion or inhibit contraction. Okay. So that's splanchnic nerve leading to a collateral ganglion option. Okay, and then the last option, well, almost last option, is thoracic viscera option. So for thoracic viscera, it's just giving you two examples here. Same preganglionic fiber, lateral horn, ventral root, spinal nerve, ventral ramus, white rami communicans, okay? One stays at level, the other one decides to go up a level, okay? Doesn't matter, because that postganglionic fiber is going to exit the ganglion, exit the sympathetic trunk ganglion, and go directly to the effector. Okay, so the gray rami communicans is not utilized in this pathway. The postganglionic fiber directly exits the sympathetic trunk and goes straight to the effector. Again, providing a faster effect. Okay, that's thoracic viscera. And that's specifically heart and lung, because that's what you find in the thorax, right? Those are the only two organs we find. So that's how your body can control heart rate and respiration so quickly. Okay. Okay. All right. So the adrenal glands, we mentioned, produce adrenaline, okay? Adrenaline is a major neurotransmitter in the sympathetic nervous system and sympathetic pathways. So, the adrenal gland sitting on top of the kidney, also called the suprarenal gland, okay, is a solid organ. So it has an outer cortex and an inner medulla, okay? The medulla of the adrenal gland is an extension of the autonomic nervous system. And it's an extension of the autonomic nervous system because it has these cells in it. We're calling them right now adrenal medulla cells. Okay? Those medulla cells serve as the postganglionic neuron. Okay? And those adrenal medulla cells are going to secrete norepinephrine and or epinephrine. If a preganglionic neuron fires it off, it's going to secrete those neurotransmitters directly into your bloodstream. Okay, your body's natural upper. So people that have adrenal gland issues, if they have problems with this gland, they constantly feel fatigued. Like they just can't muster the energy to do anything. Everything is just such an effort because their body's upper is not being secreted naturally and normally. Okay. Okay. So these next slides, they're basic rudimentary drawings. You can utilize them when you're drawing your pathways. You don't have to. If it's just, you don't like it, it's too confusing, don't worry about it. It's just a way for you to visualize it. And again, it supports the lecture supplement that I gave you guys. I'm not gonna have you draw it on an exam, but again, practicing where the cell bodies are, where the axons go, is important, okay? So, as a review, what do I want you to know, okay? I want you to know when each particular division is active. I want you to know the lengths of the nerves, the locations of the cell bodies, of both the preganglionic and postganglionic, and I want you to know neurotransmitters that are released. And wow, what a big surprise, I gave you guys a handout that's gonna address all those questions. You're welcome. Okay, so this is just driving home vagus. Again, vagus, huge responsibility. Parasympathetic effects only, okay? It's going to affect the heart and the lungs. It's also going to affect digestive organs, small intestine, and basically the first half of your large intestine, okay? The remainder is the sacral division. Sacral division is the remainder of the large intestine, and then you've got the rectum, the anus, and then urinary organs and genitals, okay? That's the sacral division of parasympathetic responsibilities. All right, so that's it. I'm just kind of driving home the fact that the vagus nerve is kind of a big deal. For this one, I just want you to remember that visceral motor pathways are stimulated by sensory neurons, okay? So, and the sensory neurons that we're talking about here are visceral sensory neurons. Okay, so they're gonna sense stretch, temperature, pressure, vibration, pain, okay? And they're going to elicit a certain response, okay? So for example, if your brain is interpreting pain, or if you've got visceral sensory neurons that are sensing pain in your stomach, okay? Maybe there's something that you ate that wasn't so hot. That might stimulate sympathetic pathways to induce a visceral reflex, which would be vomiting, right? Something you don't have control over. Smooth muscle of your stomach contracts, it doesn't want what's in there, it's coming out, whether you like it or not. Anyone that's had food poisoning knows that. Okay. Okay, so that's all I really want you to remember for this particular slide. There's nothing too major. And these pathways, don't memorize them. We're going to talk about them more in urinary system. These are just examples of visceral motor reflexes. So your ability to urinate, your ability to have a bowel movement, okay? That's all smooth muscle contractions or smooth muscle relaxation that you have no control over. However, we do have skeletal muscle that surrounds our sphincters. So fortunately, if you have to go to the bathroom as an adult, you don't pee your pants, right? You can like pucker up and say, okay, all right, I need to go, right? So there's like skeletal muscle override. But your body, regardless, will let you know, right, if you have to go. And if you hold it for too long, eventually, your body's gonna win, right? So you kind of have to listen to those neurons in your cerebral cortex and keep going. You've gotta go, you've gotta go, you've gotta go, you've gotta go. Okay. Okay, again, nothing new here. The medulla, we know the medulla controls heart rate, it controls respiratory rate, and overall, the king of the castle is the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus can tell the medulla yes or no, okay? So hypothalamus is the big boss, but medulla is the boss. Medulla is doing all the standard overseeing, and the hypothalamus can decide. And we'll talk more about that in endocrine system, about how the hypothalamus controls the medulla oblongata. So it's kind of a nice segue here into what we're gonna listen to next week. Again, don't memorize the pathway, it's just another example of a reflex, okay? Your blood pressure. So if your blood pressure is too high, you have receptors that are living, oh, what a big surprise. What blood vessel is this?
Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
it's Common
Oh,
carotid.
brachiocephalic trunk, and then it branches into your right subclavian and your right common carotid, which splits into your external and internal carotid. So right at the fork, okay, which is kind of important because that feeds your brain. If your blood pressure is too high, danger, danger, okay, your body goes into sensory overload, okay, synapsing in the medulla oblongata. It's going to fire off the vagus nerve. The cell bodies of your vagus nerve actually live in the medulla, just FYI, but not anything you have to memorize, but it with structure comes function. So the cell bodies of the vagus nerve are in the medulla. They get stimulated to come down to the heart and cause heart rate to go down. Okay, so this is, again, because it's a cranial nerve, we know it's parasympathetic only. The stimulus is increased blood pressure, so if we're reducing heart rate, that's overall going to reduce blood pressure. Okay, so it's just a nice example. And again, these are things that we don't have control over. I mean, you just get up every day and do your whatever, and you don't think about your blood pressure, you know, when you get up in the morning, or your body is constantly monitoring this for you. Crazy, crazy. Okay, perfect time. So let's do the handout, okay? And then that won't take too long. You guys will have a half hour to be able to get some sunshine and a snack. And